Hello, everyone. We'll be starting very shortly here. And I think I'll play one of the things that prompted me to talk about linkages. So we'll be getting back to that sometime shortly. Um, and welcome. I'm Ed Pegg Jr., and this is the Mathematical Game Series. And today we'll be talking about linkages. This talk is this series of talks. It follows in the tradition of Martin Gardner, who ran the mathematical games column for Scientific American for many years. And one of the things Martin Gardner talked about in several of his books was linkages. And there was something that came across my feed a month ago that I thought was very interesting. So I thought I would try to replicate that. But first, I usually mention that we often have many demonstrations on a topic, and linkages is no exception. But in the news there's a new highest prime number. Usually when there's something of recreational mathematics in the news, I'll try to start the talk by touching on it. So this is now the new largest prime number. It's a Mersenne prime. And Martin Gardner talked about Mersenne primes in his column on perfect numbers. So we also have a new highest known perfect number as well. And we can find out how it starts and ends. Here's how the largest prime number starts and ends, and here's how the new largest perfect number starts and ends. And well, Martin Gardner wrote this original column. I think they got up to the first 24 Mersenne primes. We're now up to 52 Mersenne primes. So what is a linkage? Well, let me bring that video back. Here's an example of a walking linkage. This weird table here. The components of this are linkages, and each leg is designed to have a flat section that allows this walking technique. So how can we bring that about? So first, what is a linkage? It's a series of connected rigid bars. And for example, your arms and fingers are linkages. And here's an example of a very simple linkage. Here's where Martin Gardner discusses it with the Kemp's linkage for trisecting an angle. With this little doodad here, he claims that you could lay this object on an angle and the other two parts would automatically trisect the angle. And we can see that here. Here's the trisector. The angle goes from this bar to this bar. And as you as you adjust the angles, you automatically get a trisection. Like so. So that's an example of a mechanical linkage there. And I'll be talking about a lot of these linkages. Here's a linkage for drawing a straight line. Hart's inversor. So there's, I'm not sure how to say that person's name. And here's another way of drawing a straight line with another linkage. So these are two objects that convert a circular motion into a straight line. And that's something that's valuable for robotics. So these are two of the linkages that were considered for things like the Jansen's walker, which I'll get to. Here's another simple linkage for converting rotations into straight lines. And these are all valuable in things like engines as well. We can, of course, adjust things. The pump jack is a standard object seen in oil derricks, and it also uses a linkage. So these are built on geometric constraints, and there's usually some degree of freedom for how things will move. Here's a way of making a copy of an object to scale. 100 years ago, when they needed to make a smaller copy of something, this was one of the techniques was used. Somebody would scribe the object necessary to make it either larger or smaller using one of these pantographs. We of course have lazy Susans. This is a classic technique still seen many places. And with these linkages, you can generate many types of curves. So for example, here we're rotating around the red circle, and the linkage inscribes a cissoid. This is a variation of the inversor that we saw a few slides back, where they changed a circular motion into a straight line, but you can also get these other curves. And it's a unsolved question whether for any particular closed curve, whether there's a linkage that can create the curve. It's believed that there is such a linkage, but most of the knowledge about linkages is limited to 5 bars. It's still kind of an open field for 6 bars and above. So it's unclear whether there's any way of solving that problem at the current time. So here's a simple 3-bar linkage that creates the lemniscate. The midpoint of the 3 bars produces this infinity curve known as the lemniscate. One type of linkage I don't show in this talk is the guilloche patterns. If you pull out any bill anywhere in the world, there are curves on that bill that are made by making wheels within wheels within wheels. Those are called guilloche patterns. Whether it's possible to make a copy of a particular curve produced by one of these guilloche machines is also an unsolved problem. So here's a more complicated linkage. And these are all adjustable. I'm not exactly sure what this linkage does. I should probably have looked at that. Yes, this is a demonstration of a particular linkage. The Quadrilateral is a common feature of linkages. Once you've got two things parallel and you've hooked them up, it will stay a parallelogram, and that allows you to make adjustments, but keeping things relatively constrained. This concept of the parallelogram. So that's a very frequent thing seen in linkages. And here's one of the big discoveries within linkages by Chevyshev, who has many different spellings for his name. This particular curve here, the lambda linkage, Chevyshev somehow came up with this and noticed that with this simple linkage, you get a closed curve. The previous items I showed here that have straight lines, they're not closed curves, they're infinite lines, and you can't do too much with an infinite line. But here you have this long straight section, and then it loops back to itself. So Chevyshev found this, and he thought this was an interesting linkage, and a whole bunch of robotics is now based on this particular linkage here, including some that we'll get to later. I don't know how he managed to come up with solving this, because the math is very tricky. I tried to recreate his original discovery for this, and even with computers, the math is rather tricky. So I'm surprised he managed to solve this by hand. Here's another exploitation of parallelograms and scissors-like motions. The Hoverman sphere, which something we'll see later, is also based on this concept. So now we get to more complicated items with variations on a curve on setting the bars here. We can get different closed curves out of the object. And this is a simple 4-bar linkage that includes a ground bar, a crank, a rocker, and a coupler. So here's one of the curves you can make, but as soon as you change the settings of the bars, you get a different curve. So this is one thing that has been explored. I don't think it's been explored completely. There's a lot of use of artificial intelligence and annealing and improvement for, you have a particular set of bars, now try to recreate this particular curve. And that's something that was done with the Carpentapod I showed at the start. They basically took an existing linkage, they wanted to change something, so they just tossed it into a computer system and did artificial learning to try to come up with a better closed curve. Here's another linkage here. Here's a step-by-step for how this is set up. So we pick a fixed point C. We start with 2 fixed points, and we choose a third point, and then we draw circles through them. We find a particular parallelogram to work with, and then reflect a line through E back to F, and that gives points of the linkage. Now let's see if we can do this right. So as we move the linkage around, we get this curve here, another lemniscate. But as we change the bars, we get different curves. This one isn't rendering well here. I think I need to stay outside this range in order for everything to work correctly. Yeah, it doesn't want to go down this way. Here's a classic expanding structure. This is used in satellites. They will deploy this, and origami is also used quite frequently for things that need to be compact when launched, but large when out in space. And this is one of the classic usage things used in those applications. And another scissors-like object, but with a different geometry. And one more here. Niels de Temmerman used this. Another lemniscate, Cassini curve. So we can rotate around the circle, and that causes a curve to form. Another usage of parallelograms. I often like to look at objects that have been in the public domain for many years, just to see how they get over-engineered now. Let's see, here's a more complicated curve, a glissette, a geometric locus of a point fixed to a curve sliding inside another curve. So there are 3 glissettes shown here. And as we change the eccentricity, we change the curve. So one thing I want to do is catalog all of these curves and create a set of linkages that produce them. But it'll take a while for me to compile that. Here's another 4-bar linkage. As we move the fixed curve here, we get behavior on the other object. So here's a 4-bar linkage, and as we adjust things, we get different curves. So I think it would be interesting to have a nice catalog of all the possible curves for, say, a 4-bar linkage, the different sorts of 4-bar linkages. Here's the Hoverman sphere. These have been popular for, I think, almost 30 years now, but it's based on a very simple geometric concept. And as you pull the object apart, it expands. one of the first people to really work with linkages was Leonardo da Vinci, and he was able to construct many mechanisms with basic linkages that hadn't been seen. The first person who really treated the subject of linkages seriously was Kemp, and here's one of his objects here. This allows you to add two angles together. So here's the two angles here. And let's see. Let AOC and COC. Didn't actually try this one. Let AOC equals COC and let B equals BOC. There we go. Then AOA. Okay, right. So that's a linkage that can add these two angles to get those two. I'll need to play with this one more. Apologies that I don't understand this one completely. I think it works something like that. And the multiplier is a little bit easier to understand. As we move the bars, we get a doubling of the angle. And we can change the bars to get different multiplications. So with we have addition, multiplication, and translation, which is based on parallelograms. With these three objects working together, it's possible to create many different geometric results with the combination of addition, multiplication, and translation. And now we get something more complicated. Inverting a figure 8 curve. And as these adjust as we adjust the curves, as we adjust one bar, the curve changes. Let's see if we can get a lemniscate here. It's difficult to get things to move on some of these strange curves because we're calculating everything in real time. Oh, I'll work on that one. But we can get some very unusual results out of these figure 8 curves. Here's a linkage that creates a flat section here. As we change the angle, we can adjust how the curve looks. This is a variation on the Chebyshev lambda curve. So you can see how these vary. And when you feed these systems into a computer and you're looking for something specific, it can usually zero in on website optimal very quickly. So I mentioned Jansen Walker. Here's an example for how that looks like when it walks. And we can do multiple machines here. And these have been built, there's quite a few videos of the Jansen walkers walking on beaches and things like that. So here's a list of the lengths used in this linkage in order to create this effect. And now we get to even more complicated things. So here's a more complicated 5-bar linkage. Making that particular curve. But as we adjust things, we get a different curve. It can be somewhat unpredictable how a linkage will behave as it's adjusted. So this one has a sharp spike. I'm not sure if that would be useful for anything. Here's a walking machine built almost purely on the Chevy Chev Lambda linker. Excuse me. And we can see how it looks like when it's walking here. The Carpentapod that I showed at the start, and which I will be showing again, is based on a variation on this theme. For some reason, though, people prefer wheels for devices moving things around. These just haven't caught on yet. Linkages are used extensively in cars, and this demonstration shows how steering works with wheels. When you're turning, the wheels aren't actually parallel. They're kept so that so that one wheel will be turning in the radius of its circle, and the other wheel will be turning the radius of its circle. They're working on different circles. If they were kept parallel at all times, the tires would wear down a lot faster, and that was something that was seen in early automobiles. And this linkage was developed to fix that problem. And once they figured this linkage out, cars were handled much better. And here's another demonstration of that. This is Ackerman geometry, a zero slip development for wheels and cars. more on the walker. As the wheel turns, we get a movement at the bottom. So the walker I showed earlier has something like this. But as we adjust the bars, we get different effects. Sometimes they're not flat on the bottom anymore. And here's the carpentapod. You can see that the round part at the bottom stays on the line for a relatively long time. This was designed by Carpentier because his when he tried to make the walker, it wasn't very friendly on wood because there's a sharp point at the bottom of the construction, and that point would just wear down and then the walker would stop working. So he wanted to make a round object at the bottom. He figured that would work better as a walker and produce more smooth results. And it seems that he's correct. This object does seem to work a little bit better than the Jensen Walker, and he basically modeled this just by tossing the framework into the AI and then had the bars kind of adjust automatically to try to find the optimized version. So let me show you that object again. Here, the carpentapod table. Using 6 linkages in parallel. Let's see here. And many thanks for listening. So I mentioned a few things that were unsolved, whether for a given curve, whether there's a linkage that matches them, and for things like Yosh patterns seen in currency, whether you have a currency which is based on nested wheels, whether there's a way of reproducing that curve with the wheels. Those are 2 unsolved problems in mathematics, and I'll be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any. You can just post them in the chat area. Any questions? Oh, so many thanks for attending my talk.